Hello, class. This is a hopefully brief little lesson or walkthrough of what we like to call the plot graph. What you see in front of you on this slide is the typical structure of a story. Almost all stories can be mapped out on this, what we call plot graph. Almost all stories have a short introduction, an inciting force, some aspects of the rising action, a climax, falling action, and resolution. And so it's an important thing, and you can, if you think about this, the next time you're watching a movie or a TV show, try to imagine each of these things in the story because they're probably there. First of all, we'll talk about the introduction. Setting is usually introduced along with some major characters. And most authors try to keep this really brief. It's very short. The introduction is mostly information that the audience needs just to get them started. But if you go on too long with an introduction, it's not very interesting. So when I say setting, that's time and place. You get a sense of when the story takes place. And that could be things like the season, the year, or the time of day, whatever's important to that particular part of the story. So if winter was important, they would tell you this in the beginning of the story. Or if maybe it was happening in the morning, that was important because it was 9:30 in the morning and school was just about to start. Those types of things would be mentioned or at least covered and introduced. And also place. So whatever aspect of where you are in the story is important would be introduced here. So it could be a room. A story is taking place in the living room with a television and a fireplace. If that's important, you'll find that out in the introduction. Or if the city is important, this story takes place in New York City. If that happens to be important, you'll get that information in the introduction. So place can be a big place. It could be a very specific place. Time could be a, big piece of time, like a season or a year. It could also be very specific, like a time of day. But you'll get that information in the introduction along with an important character or two. Now the inciting force is really where the action begins. This is your first indication that the main character is going to have some kind of complication, some kind of conflict to solve, a problem that needs to be overcome. So we like to call this the initial complication of the story. Really, from here on out, the main character is trying to solve whatever problem they have. And so if you want to identify the inciting force, you got to really figure out what the conflict of the story is, and then you got to work your way backwards. When did that major conflict first get introduced? What was the first thing that happened in the story that we could say started the character off having to solve a problem, a major conflict? So like it says here, it's central to the main conflict. Now on the plot graph, rising action would be that slope going straight up and to the right. This is a series of interrelated complications. One thing leads to the next. This is the meat of the story. It's probably 90% of the story. The introduction is probably a very small part, 5 or 10%, but the rising action is almost all of the story. So, and it could be hundreds of things. It could also be a very small number of things, 3 or 4 or 5 things. But with each problem the main character has to solve, they will solve that problem, and then another problem will arise, and they'll solve that problem. And so the rising action is all of those little complications in the story that add up to solving the big complication, whatever the conflict is. It also is important that the rising action is connected so that everything happens for a reason. One thing leads to the next. This happens, problem solved, another problem pops up, solve that problem, and all of those problems and solutions are interconnected. So after you make your way all the way up to the top of the plot graph, you get to what we call the climax. This is best thought of as the last exciting thing to happen in the story. Some people like to say it's the most exciting thing, but of course we could argue about what the most exciting thing of anything is and maybe never get anywhere. Some people will argue that something else in the story was the most important or most exciting thing. So this is best thought of as the last exciting thing. This is where the conflict is finally solved. So the major conflict is solved in the climax. There's also something that happens close to this moment in the story called the crisis. And the crisis um, can also happen at the same time as the climax, usually happens just before it. And this is a moment, you can almost see it happening in a movie or a TV show, that the main character gets an idea. Oh, this is how I'm finally going to solve the conflict of the story. This is how I'm going to defeat the enemy, or this is how I'm going to win the prize, or this is how I'm going to get to the top of the mountain, or whatever problem the person's trying to solve. So it's the crisis kind of happens in the main character's head, and that moves the main character off to finally solve the major conflict in the climax, the last exciting thing that happened in the story. So after the conflict is solved, there's not much left to do, right? So most authors try to keep this part of the story very short. Sometimes it's hard to even identify falling action. Here in the falling action, though, tension is unraveled and unanswered questions are resolved. It is always short because nothing of great interest is left to tell, and sometimes the author leaves it out altogether, choosing to stop at the climax. So it's possible that you could say, there was no falling action in my story. The story ended right at the climax. But usually there's a little bit of unraveling, a sense of the tension is over, and the writer kind of lets you off the hook a little bit by just relaxing out the story a little bit. Finally, there's something called resolution. Again, this is usually very short and sometimes even hard to identify because authors, it's just not much fun, this part of the story. So they try to keep it as short as possible or you'll lose people's attention. Anyway, in the resolution, all tension is resolved. And there's like a sense of normality or normalcy that returns to the story. It's almost like the main character has gone through some sort of an adventure. This main character has been taken out of their ordinary existence. They've gone through some troubles, moved through this sort of experience that changed them. And then at the very end, even though they've changed and they're in a new place, there's like a sense of returning back to the normalcy that existed before the story began. So those are all the parts of the story. This is the final part of the task that you have to complete. Each of these questions will kind of help you to discover these parts of the story. So answering these questions about Land to the Slaughter will help you understand how the plot graph works and how it can be applied to different stories. So complete that now.